Mitt Romney's continued inability to sweep Republicans off their feet has renewed party concerns about the candidate field. Is it time for a fresh face in the Republican race? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lisa Fletcher. Mitt Romney went on the attack in this week's Republican candidate's presidential debate. And for the first time, he set his sights firmly on rival Rick Santorum.
But while I was fighting to save the Olympics, you were fighting to save the bridge to nowhere.
It's a sign of how seriously the Romney camp is now taking Santorum, who in recent weeks has emerged as his main challenger for the right to go up against Barack Obama in November. In just a few days, the Republican primary season kicks in again, with votes in Arizona and Romney's home state of Michigan. And according to the latest polls, Michigan's voters have Romney and Santorum in a dead heat, leading to the possibility of a damaging defeat for Romney in a state he was once considered certain to win. The failure of the former Massachusetts governor to really establish a clear lead in the Republican nomination race has left several senior figures in the party concerned. Some are worried that the party is being diverted too much into internal squabbles rather than reaching out to new and undecided voters. And what was once thought unthinkable, a new candidate joining the primaries, could be openly debated should Romney slip up in Michigan. So does the Republican race need a new candidate? With me to discuss this is Tom Redmond, a Republican consultant and supporter of Mitt Romney. Next to him, Carrie Budoff Brown, a writer with Politico magazine, and also Liz Mair, a former advisor on Rick Perry's presidential campaign. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there is this slightly increased volume every week that Republicans seem to be holding out for a hero in the campaign. Liz, I want to start with you. Is it realistic to think that Republicans could actually insert a new candidate successfully into the GOP race at this point?
I personally think that it is not. I would personally like to see a different candidate enter the general election than any of the ones that remain in the contest. But realistically, it takes quite a bit of time to actually build up a campaign in a way that's going to be functional and capable of winning. And I think we're really to the point where that's just not an option anymore, and we're going to have to go to battle with the army that we have, not the one that we might want.
But the current dialogue that we keep hearing is Tuesday is going to be the big decider. Michigan is going to really lay down the law on where things go for Romney and the GOP from there. Is that true, Carrie?
I mean, it seems like every time that voters in some state go to the polls, that is what is being said, particularly in this cycle. I mean, you know, Florida was viewed as this, big recovery for Mitt Romney. He did not sustain that in the next state. Rick Santorum did very well. Now he's sort of the front runner. I mean, I would say this is going to go back and forth for quite some time. I think if a Michigan win for Romney would be very good for him. I mean, it will help him.
More than be good, though, because, Tom, and I want you to talk about this, Michigan is special. It's Romney's home state. He was supposed to win it by a landslide. He's pretty much in a dead heat with Santorum there.
Well, it's his father was governor of Michigan. He grew up there. Certainly, it's important to win for Romney. But it's full of blue-collar Catholic voters. Let's be honest, Santorum connects with those voters very well. The other thing is we tend in politics to, and I am as guilty of this as anybody, we tend to treat everything that happens as the single most important event ever. And the last three primaries, Rick Santorum won. He netted 0 delegates. But the media narrative since then has been that Romney's in big trouble. And I suspect that on Tuesday, if Romney wins Michigan and Arizona, the new narrative will then be that Romney is the front runner, that he's on his way to the nomination. So we have to keep these things in context and remember that the narrative is such that Santorum looks really good because he was the last one to win a primary. But I think that once Romney wins Michigan and Arizona, which I believe he will, I think then it'll be very clear, again, that Romney's the favorite for the nomination.
Liz, you're a strategist. You analyze these races. Is there too much analyzing and microscopic vision going on here, not a macro view of what's happening?
Yeah, I think that there's a tendency to want to look at the detail rather than the broader picture a little bit, as Tom suggested. In politics, there's a tendency to feel like whatever the particular story of the day is a huge, big deal. And oftentimes when you're working on these campaigns, you find that the thing that seemed like a huge, big deal 3 months ago, now you look back on it and you can barely even remember sort of what that was all about or what was going on. And so I do think it's important to be able to sort of see the wood from the trees and look at a broader picture of what's going on. And I think that what Tom is suggesting is basically right. When I look at the broader picture, Santorum is giving Romney a little bit of a rougher ride than what I would have expected, and certainly than what Romney wants. But at the end of the day, Romney has got the structure, he's got the experience of running before, he's got a little bit more discipline than what you see with Santorum, and I think it's pretty much impossible that he will not be the nominee at this stage.
So you, and I want to see if you all three agree, you think it's essentially not possible that we're going to see a new candidate enter this race?
I mean, I agree, because I think that any of the candidates who would potentially be strongest, someone like Chris Christie or Jeb Bush, those are the folks you would think would step in. Those potential candidates are well positioned for 2016. So you would have to wonder if they would take the risk, and it's a huge risk if they would get in at this point and risk their own political capital on what is a very small proposition that they would be successful. So they are risking their positioning for 2016 when they could be strong come 2016. To do it now, it's just so hard to see.
Let's look at actually how feasible it is for a new candidate to end up winning the Republican nomination. Under the rules, a candidate has to win 1,144 delegates during the primary season to win a majority and secure the nomination. It's thought a new candidate jumping in now would only be able to compete in 8 of the remaining primaries. That gives you a possible 519 delegates up for grabs. But a good showing in those primaries could not only establish that candidate's credibility, but also mean none of the other candidates reach that 1,144 figure. And that would raise the prospect of what is known as a brokered convention, which essentially turns August's Republican convention into one big debate to decide the nominee. Tom, talk a little bit about what a brokered convention is.
Well, first we have to be clear about the distinction between a brokered convention and a contested convention. A brokered convention is in the old days when the party bosses would go off into a smoke-filled room and they'd discuss amongst themselves and they'd choose a nominee. I think that's extremely likely in 2012 under any circumstance. For starters, I don't know who the party bosses would be that would go have that conversation. A contested convention would be where no candidate goes into the convention with enough delegates to clinch the nomination, and then you have a first ballot and then a second ballot, and potentially then you could see new candidates emerge as various states throw favorite sons into the race, someone else might come forward, and that's a contested convention, and then you would presumably continue to have ballots until somebody had enough delegates to get the nomination. But for the reasons that were just suggested now, I agree completely. I think it's highly unlikely and not in the interest of most of the strongest candidates to put themselves forward as a potential nominee at such a late date.
So Liz, while it may be unlikely that we would have a new candidate come into the race, it doesn't sound like it's all that unlikely that we could possibly have a contested convention where the nominees may all end up not having the 1144. How possible is that?
I do think it's a possibility. I think it's less of a possibility than the media narrative right now would suggest it is. I think a lot of folks in the political media are constantly looking for the outside possibility and the remote that could become reality, and covering that and maybe lending more credence to it than it really deserves. But it does exist as a possibility, definitely. And I think that speaks to the fact that the field that we've got at this point is actually a lot weaker than a lot of Republicans would like.
And how would the Republican Party emerge from a contested convention?
Well, I think it's hard to say. I mean, it's been 35 years since we've had a convention where the nominee wasn't already certain going into the convention. So it's very difficult to say how we'd come out of that, but I think it's fair to assume that any nominee coming out of a convention like that is going to be severely weakened when you're going up against an incumbent president, maybe the first billion-dollar candidate in American history. He didn't have to worry about a primary. I don't think that would be a good thing for the Republican Party at all. And one other important thing to remember, if you look at this entire primary process from the very beginning when all the candidates got in. We've had one front runner after another. And you saw this with Michelle Bachmann, with Herman Cain, Newt Gingrich. I think you're seeing it with Santorum now, where someone came to the top and then they got vetted, and then we found out that maybe they weren't who we wanted to nominate. If you come out of a contested convention with a nominee who wasn't running prior to that, you're now going to have a candidate who hasn't gone through that vetting. And I don't think that's something anyone in the Republican Party wants in the general election campaign.
I think that's right. And the thing that I would add to that is going back to my point about campaign infrastructure and how long it takes to put a good campaign infrastructure in place. We have to remember also that the RNC is at something of a disadvantage this cycle. The RNC is not the structure that it was a couple years ago. Unfortunately, the Michael Steele years, he's the previous chairman of the RNC, put it into a lot of debt, had a lot of financial difficulties. That continues to have an effect on where that organization is today. And in the context of a candidate entering the race late, I think the RNC would play a very important role, and I'm not really convinced that it's equipped to do that.
Yeah, and I would just put like a reality check on the whole conversation, you know, in Washington about this, is that, you know, in 2008, if there was ever a possibility for some kind of contested convention, it was between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, who ran neck and neck, completely, well, you know, equally matched in money and support and everything else, and it didn't happen. You know, there's a lot of talk of that. It never happened because it's not in the party's interests. Eventually, people coalesce, and eventually somebody steps out front, and it's only February. So
you raise an interesting point, and that is this DC narrative. It's as if DC is its own little universe. And what's going on here and the opinions here, do they really reflect the opinions of mainstream voters?
Well, I think it reflects to a certain extent the disconnect right now, you know, between why Mitt Romney's struggling, to, you know, to a certain extent, or just why there's still a race. Why Rick Santorum, who does not have infrastructure and does not have as much money and is not as disciplined with messaging, why he's running neck and neck with Romney. It's because, you know, there's just discontent about.
Could it be
the
that
Romney
the DC
choice.
narrative is wrong?
Well, no, I don't know. I mean, we perpetuate storylines here. I think that it reflects to a certain extent some reality, but it may reflect a kind of a different reality, that there's just the field's unsettled, and it's reflecting that fact, which I think is a fact. I think it's borne out in the way the primary season has run its course so far.
And the other thing too is it's important not to, you know, everything's in the context of what we've seen so far. The primary process is about selecting a nominee, and if everyone in the party were happy with a particular candidate, we wouldn't need to have a primary. But because Mitt Romney has been, frankly, the only serious candidate who's run in terms of money, infrastructure, looking presidential on the debate stage, his expectations have been extremely high from the beginning. So every time he loses a state, the new narrative is that Mitt Romney's in big trouble. Well, Hillary Clinton was the inevitable nominee, and as you said, there was a lot of talk that she could go all the way to the convention. But Barack Obama lost a lot of states in the primaries, and he ended up being the nominee, and he was obviously a very strong candidate, and he won. So it's easy to get caught up in the fact that because Mitt Romney's supposed to be a juggernaut, that he'll never lose any states, that he'll never have any setbacks in the campaign trail. And I'm not aware of a candidate that's ever gone through the primary process and been his party's nominee that hasn't had those setbacks.
But he's been fairly easily flicking off these other contenders. You know, Michelle Bachmann rises to the top, she falls off. The next one rises up, falls off. Santorum is not falling off.
Well, it's still only, we have to think that only a couple of weeks ago he wasn't doing that well. So, I mean, it has only been a few weeks, and these front runners tend to run their course for a few weeks.
Well, but so he did win Iowa, although we didn't find out until 2 weeks after the fact.
Sure, he won Iowa, but he fared poorly in South Carolina. He got fourth in South Carolina. Florida, he didn't even go there. I mean, so he had a bad stretch, right? And we didn't think that he was coming around. Newt Gingrich was telling him to get out of the race. You run your course for a couple weeks. We have to see if he gets past Super Tuesday. Like, does he really have the staying power? And I think the next few weeks will show that, or prove that one way or another.
Let's take a look at what voters would likely do if the contests were held today. Romney would easily beat Santorum in Arizona by about 11 percentage points, according to all the polls averaged out by the nonprofit group Real Clear Politics. But as we mentioned earlier, Romney's lead in his home state of Michigan has collapsed. He and Santorum are pretty much in a dead heat, right around the 34% mark. But the numbers aren't convincing for either candidate in a matchup with Barack Obama. Obama would likely beat Mitt Romney 49 to about 44% if the general election were held today, which ironically is the same voter split as a Santorum-Obama race. So how does the GOP and leaders in the GOP not take Santorum seriously when he's within the very same margin of error against the president as Mitt Romney is? Liz?
I think the short answer to that is anybody who's followed Rick Santorum's career, it's very difficult to take him as seriously as it is Mitt Romney. Now, I'm not particularly a huge fan of either one of them, but Mitt Romney, generally speaking, is capable of sticking to a message, not going sort of rogue. He actually has a viable campaign infrastructure, or at least as viable as we're going to get at this point in time. He has done this before. He is a serious person with a serious track record of covering all the bases when you're looking at what one has to do in order to govern. When you're looking at Rick Santorum, you're looking at a guy that generally is characterized as a culture warrior. He's seen as being quite fringe. He doesn't have a lot of broad or deep support. And so it is difficult to look at him and treat him seriously, even if that's what the polling shows.
The other thing to remember is the more voters learn about Rick Santorum, the less they like him. A week ago, if we'd been here, the poll you would have shown in Michigan would have had Santorum something like 9 points ahead. Do you have him dead heat? I saw one this morning that showed Romney 3 points ahead in Michigan. Santorum lost his home state in 2006 by the biggest margin of any incumbent senator in American history. Rick Santorum, as he gets vetted, doesn't tend to appeal to people beyond his base. And I think that, you know, it's easy to put up a poll now when a lot of voters aren't paying attention that shows Rick Santorum in a dead heat with Obama. But as the election were to go on, if Rick Santorum were the nominee, I think you would see a big lead for the president that would sustain itself through the election.
But these polls aren't of Republican primary voters. They're random polls crossing the United States, crossing all races and ethnicities and genders.
Sure, but if the only thing you've heard about Rick Santorum right now is that he's the new rising star in the Republican Party, you're a lot more likely to say you'd consider voting for him than if you know all the other things about Rick Santorum that have caused him to lose support over the years.
But there was a counterintuitive poll just today in the Post about his support among Republican women rising 13 points over the last
Let's take a look at that,
week.
Carrie. People have been concerned about Santorum's focus on socially conservative issues and the possible effect on women, but a new poll that came out just today that she was mentioning shows that while Mitt Romney is still in the lead among Republican voting women, Santorum's support has jumped up 13 points since January. That's to 57%. Newt Gingrich's support, however, has plummeted to 37%. And that's a little counterintuitive given the religious organizations, should they or should they not have to provide birth control to women who work for them, controversy that's been out there now for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I read the story today and looked at the poll. I couldn't quite, it just is not what you would have expected. I don't know what it says. I don't know if it's going to hold, but it's something to watch.
But I imagine what this really is probably reflecting the fact that there are just a lot of Republicans out there, women and men, who are not comfortable with Mitt Romney. If you look at poll after poll, Mitt Romney appears to consistently have a ceiling. He's not somebody who 50% of the party right now feels ready to get behind. And so I think this is one of the things that you see with various people peaking, and it's not specific to a particular gender. If you don't like Mitt Romney and you're a woman and you're only just tuning in and looking at your options now, it's totally possible that you're going to answer the poll and say, well, actually, I think quite well about Rick Santorum.
It also presumes that the only thing women voters care about, specifically Republican women, is contraception, is birth control, things like that. Women vote on taxes, they vote on national security just like men do. So, you know, polls of women don't necessarily tell you anything about social issues specifically, any more than other issues.
Liz, what can you divine at this stage in the race in terms of how Romney feels about Santorum? Does he feel like Santorum's nipping at his heels, or does he feel like this is a passing phase?
I think they're treating him as a bit of a threat. I think if you watched the debate the other night, he was pretty happy to attack Santorum. He came ready and armed with his research and his oppo. And he did a pretty good job of deploying it. Frankly, that is a major problem for Rick Santorum. If you watch him in debates, he comes off as angry, flippant sometimes, very dismissive of views that he doesn't necessarily agree with. And he spent pretty much that whole debate explaining. At the end of the day, we've got a saying in politics in this country, if you're explaining, you're losing. And that's pretty much what Rick Santorum spent the whole time doing. And Romney pushed him there.
Well, we've actually got some sound from that particular debate. Let's take a listen to it.
If you had not supported him, if we had said no to Arlen Specter, we would not have Obamacare. So don't look at me. Take a look in the mirror.
You have a new television ad that labels him a fake. Why?
Because he's a fake. Unreal, Ron. Unreal.
I was fighting for those things. Our games are successful. But while I was fighting to save the Olympics, you were fighting to save the bridge to nowhere.
Quickly.
So clearly some planned lines. Romney went into this debate knowing that he was going to attack Rick Santorum and attack him hard. Does that indicate that he's feeling a little vulnerable?
I think it does, but I don't think he's feeling crazy, overly vulnerable about it. I think he recognizes that if you prod Santorum, particularly in a debate, he will show a side of himself that people don't like. And that's exactly what came out in that debate. You know, they were asked in that debate, if you could pick one word that describes yourself, what would it be? And I believe Santorum's answer was courage, when he basically spent the whole debate talking about why he had done things that did not conform to his supposed principles, that frankly were not courageous. They were taking the easy way out. And so, you know, I think Romney is treating him seriously, but I don't think Romney needs to push him very hard or attack him very hard to expose the weaknesses that Rick Santorum has.
Tom?
I think there's two reasons anybody in Romney's position would have done that. One, like Liz said, is there's a tactical reason in that Rick Santorum has a short fuse. He doesn't respond well to criticism or attacks. The other thing is it's part of that vetting I was talking about before. Time after time, Rick Santorum has demonstrated throughout his career that he's a big government Republican. He may be socially conservative, but he believes in using the power of government to enforce his own agenda. And that's something a lot of Republican primary voters are not fond of, and a lot of them probably don't know it about Santorum. So again, it's part of that vetting process that any candidate is going to bring things like that up because they're very natural targets with a candidate like Santorum.
I think that's right. And the other thing I would just really quickly add is that one of Romney's biggest vulnerabilities is that people see him as being somewhat insincere and taking whatever position appears to be politically expedient and then trying to characterize himself as something that he's not. He tries to characterize himself as, quote, severely conservative. That's what he said in a recent speech. And I don't think anybody really believes that. That's a problem for Romney. The more that he can point out that it's a problem for Rick Santorum too, the better he's going to do. And Tom's right. It is a problem for Rick Santorum. He's extremely socially conservative. He's fiscally quite liberal.
Carrie?
You know, I was just going to say, though, I think the criticisms of Romney, though, as being not sincere, that does tap into, like, a long-standing criticism of who Romney is. So those attacks generally gain more traction than they do against someone like Rick Santorum, however, who does seem to have a greater ability to connect with voters who are struggling economically. He is through and through a social conservative, right? So to question sort of his credentials on Planned Parenthood as he was in the debate the other night, I'm not sure how much those criticisms will gain traction because they're not tapping into some kind of long-standing vulnerability of his. And so I think there's a little bit of difference between Romney and Santorum in that respect.
So the three of you don't see a new candidate jumping into the race. It sounds like you all pretty much think Romney is going to be the nominee. Tom, how well is Rick Santorum positioned to be a vice presidential contender?
It's really hard to say. I think that Santorum, probably because of the weaknesses we've talked about here, would not be well positioned to be a VP candidate.
Even if he wins Michigan and Ohio?
if he wins Michigan and Ohio, we've got a completely different conversation going. But you know, then it's a question of whether he's going to be the nominee rather than the vice presidential candidate. But I think if you're looking to appeal to a lot of the people that Santorum brings to the table, like Catholic, blue-collar voters, where admittedly Romney does have a problem, but so does President Obama. I think someone like Chris Christie is probably a better pick from that perspective because he doesn't have all those vulnerabilities that Santorum does.
Right, and on that note, we are going to have to end our show, but thanks to all of you for joining us today. That's it from the Inside Story team in Washington, D.C. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.